Hi, my name is Karen Fabian, and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. And this is my book called Stretched, Build Your Yoga Business, Grow Your Teaching Techniques. The book is available on Amazon, and today I thought I'd bring one of the chapters to life. This chapter has to do with bringing sound principles of anatomy into your teaching, and I thought it'd be helpful, and I've actually gotten some feedback from readers, that it would be helpful to provide pictures to illustrate this chapter and the concepts in it. So I thought I'd do it one better and make a video. So if you don't have the book, not a problem. If you do have the book, I'm on page 132. And we're going to go through these concepts one by one. So the first one has to do with bringing your feet hip-width distance apart. And a lot of times, teachers will give little tips about how to gauge hip width. But let's talk about, anatomically speaking, what that means. We're talking about stacking your hip joints over your ankles. And a lot of times students have kind of a weird perspective on the width of their body. And the reason we want to create this stacking is that when we stack the joints, we're more sound, we're more steady in the body because everything's in a line. So bringing the feet hip-width distance apart gives us a nice distance to work with from a stability perspective and allows the joints to be stacked. So if someone were standing like this, that obviously would be too wide. If someone were standing like this, that would be too narrow. There certainly are poses and different positions we take where we ask people to bring their feet together. But when we ask them to have their feet hip-width distance apart, we're looking for that sense of grounding from the hip joint down to the knee, down to the ankle. The next concept has to do with keeping the knees in line with the hips. And this tends to be an issue when we start to do things like back bends. When you think about taking the knees wider than the hips, and you'll see in this position my knees start to stick out beyond my hip joint, we're generally talking about having the feet turned out, which is external rotation of the hips. And as we turn open at the hip joint and subsequently at the feet, we tend to decrease the width available behind us here. This is called your sacroiliac joint. And you'll notice even if you just stand up and you bring your hand to the connection between your sacrum and your pelvis and you externally rotate your hips, you'll feel this kind of clenching happen. And if you go the opposite way and you turn your feet in, you'll feel a broadening. So it's important that students get a sense of keeping not only hip width, but keeping the knees in line with the hips as they start to do things like bend back from standing, something like this, or if they're laying on their belly and they start to lift up into a back bend. Or if they go from something like standing or even from the ground into a wheel pose, a full back bend, what generally can happen, which is very challenging to have happen when you're coming into a back bend, is to externally rotate the hips. So giving people an idea of what it means to have your feet hip width apart and your knees directly in line with your ankles is a really sound way to build, in particular, their back bends. Okay, the next concept is stacking the knee over the heel. And this tends to come up when we're talking again about stability and in shapes like lunges. So what we wouldn't want to do is allow the knee to plow past the ankle. And you'll see this a lot if you ask students to come into a lunge. They're trying to go for the stretch, and so oftentimes the alignment starts to completely disintegrate because they're really focused on lengthening the muscle. So encouraging people to use, let's say in a case like this, a block, to keep the knee directly over the heel. And when we start to move into different shapes, like a crescent lunge or like a warrior two, for instance, we want to, again, keep that knee directly over the heel so that we're building that straight line of stability. And from stability, we can definitely still get stretch without putting additional pressure on the kneecap by allowing it to plow past the heel. The next one has to do with drawing the shoulder blades together. So this would be the action that would happen if you were to interlace your fingers behind your back and draw your shoulder blades together. Your rhomboids are the muscles that adduct or draw closer your shoulder blades. So think about it like drawing your shoulder blades towards your spine. And what you can see happens as we do that is we create broadening across the collarbone. So this would be the kind of sensation you'd get in an up dog or when you take this bind here. And so cueing students to draw the shoulder blades together can create a corresponding opening through the chest, which is the exact opposite of how people are most of the time, hunching. So this is a great action to cue your students into to start to give them more space to breathe, a more upright posture, and greater stretch across muscles that generally are scrunched in. The next one has to do with shoulders back and down, and this is kind of related to drawing the shoulder blades together. When we stand in anatomical position, which is feet at hip width, knees forward, palms forward, we get that slight drawing in of the shoulder blades together. But you'll notice there's no hunch. The shoulders are back a little bit and down the back. Now sometimes people say, oh, shoving the shoulders down creates a squared effect. Well, sure, if you exaggerate anything that's a pure anatomical action, it can go bad. But if you keep these principles general and apply them with diligence, but yet a little softness, you'll find it's like a key in a lock. So here we're turning the palms forward, dropping the shoulders down. So let's say if we take the arms up, you'll notice the shoulder blades rise. That's what they're built to do. Fine, let them do that. But as we have the arms by the sides in different positions, allowing the chest to broaden and the shoulders to go a little down the back, again, creates that opening. Okay, so the next one is the top edge of the pelvis. So when we think of the pelvis, the two pelvic bones, and they're joined again, we talked back here about the sacroiliac joint, we're talking about this top rim. So we can dip it down, we can lift it up. So a lot of times teachers will cue lift the front edge of the pelvis, drop the sitting bones and the tailbone straight down. And this can be helpful for stretching the front of the thighs, so your quads and your hip flexors, especially the muscle of your quadricep that crosses your hip joint, your rectus femoris. So keeping the top edge of the pelvis level, again, keeps us in anatomical position and doesn't allow us to hyperextend or stick out too much our tailbone. Lift the front edge. The next thing is the sitting bones. These are where your hamstrings start. If I was sitting on the ground in bow pose, it'd be what I was balancing on. And it's amazing how sometimes students don't have a sense of what these are, because especially when we come into down dog, we often cue students to lift the sitting bones. Because the hamstrings can be tight, sometimes you got to bend the knees in between to lift them up. Because if the legs are totally straight, they kind of tuck in. So giving students an idea of where these are, noting that the hamstrings attach there or begin there, it's the origin, and giving them a sense of lifting the front edge, dropping sitting bones, or lifting the sitting bones up even in something like a forward fold. Again, reminding them bending their knees is completely fine and gives them a little bit more room to work with. Tailbone. This is your coccyx and commonly known as your tailbone. The tough thing with the tailbone is oftentimes when you cue people around the tailbone, they exaggerate and it tucks too much. And then you'll notice what happens. You lose the levelness of the pelvis and the front edge of the pelvis lifts up too much. So if you keep these principles working together, the overall sense will be sound. So when we talk about things like the tailbone, oftentimes in something like a warrior, if someone has really tight hip flexors, we can do it on this side, really tight hip flexors, which would be the muscle here, like your psoas, their tailbone will stick out. So you could cue them, lift the front edge of the pelvis, drop the tailbone down, pull the belly in towards your spine. And these actions will get that levelness of the pelvis and the tailbone will be dropping down. Center your hips. This is a tough one, and I'll face you for this one. This is a tough one because anything, again, taken to the extreme can create problems. So when we cue people to things like center, if the base is not where it needs to be, they can tend to shove into the shape, and that can create other problems like torquing the back knee, for instance, in this particular foot position. So here we're trying to get a sense of centering, but as teachers we need to look at what's happening at the ground so we can cue them appropriately as to position of their feet so that they can center. But generally speaking, again, coming back to anatomical position, centering the hips means just that. Bring them to face forward. Sometimes I cue people on the belly button because everybody knows where their belly button is. So I might say, center your belly button to the front of your mat, or center your belly button to the front of the room. And this creates stability. Oftentimes we're talking about it with respect to some of the other concepts we already discussed, stacking the knees over the ankles, bringing the feet to hip width. Lift the front edge of the pelvis, we talked about. That has to do with bringing it up. Not to an extreme unless we're back bending, but sometimes just bringing it to be level from what's called a tipping down or a posterior tilt. So lifting it up. The next one has to do with relaxing your upper ribs, and this oftentimes when we reach the arms up, if the hip flexors are tight, what happens is the tailbone sticks out, hyperextends, the belly protrudes, the chest kind of barrels out. So what we want to do is get students tapped into what's happening right under their chest, engaging the center line of the body, relaxing and softening there so that they get the extension of the arms without what's called the caved in back or the sway back and the hyperextension of the pelvis. So a lot of these things work together, softening the upper ribs, lifting the front edge of the pelvis, engaging the center line of the body will result in a nice stretch for the front of the thighs. And then the last one has to do with internally rotating your thigh bones. We request this oftentimes when students need to do back bends, whether they're on their belly or standing, or they're on their back and they're ready to come into bridge or wheel. And this has to do with taking the insides of the thighs muscularly and rolling it back. It's almost like if you were to go pigeon-toed, it would happen naturally. But you're keeping that hip width centered pelvis, but we're rotating the inner thighs back. So if you cue people to root down into their big toes, they'll get that sense. And guess what? When they start to internally rotate their thigh bones, that sacroiliac joint broadens and they can bend back with greater ease. So these are some anatomical concepts you can bring into your classes. If you're interested in the book, again, it's available on Amazon, and I hope you enjoyed this. Namaste. My website is barebonesyoga.com. Please send me an email with any questions you have. Thank you.